Today, I'll show you how you can secure a Blazor Server application with IdentityServer4 and how you can enforce authorization on certain pages of your application. So let's get coding. Hello, wonderful human beings. First of all, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you for leaving all those nice comments. It really means the world to me, and it's making me really happy. Thank you for supporting me in my work, and this is what keeps me going and what keeps me motivating. The fact that these tutorials are actually helpful to someone. So thank you again. Okay, so this is the second part in this tutorial series. In the first part, what we're doing is integrating IdentityServer4 with ASP.NET Identity. So please make sure to check that out first, because this tutorial is building on top of that. As always, the source code, the slides, the packages that we're working with, and all the steps can be found in the description below. So please feel free to check that out. If you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to leave them in the comments section below, and I'll make sure to respond to every single one of them. Now, let me walk you through the components of this tutorial. So, this is part 2 of this tutorial series and the last part. So it's worth recapping what we've done previously. Part 1, we've set up the API. In part 2, we've set up the identity server project that's called server. In the API project, we've set up just a simple API controller that will return it's a list of coffee shops from a SQL Server database with Entity Framework Core. And also we have created a data access project. That's just a simple class library that's got a SQL Server database installed on it with Entity Framework Core. It's got a single application DB context for the application. So that is storing only the coffee shop's entity. So it's not holding anything identity related or security related. It's only holding data that can be used for the application that the end user can see. And the server project has got IdentityServer4 installed on it. And as part of this tutorial, we'll be setting up the Blazor Server project called client. So this is a very simple Blazor Server project that will do two main things. One, will send a request to the server project to generate a token for it. Then the client application can send requests to the API using that newly generated JWT token. Then last but not least, in the last part of this tutorial, we'll be securing the client application with IdentityServer4, because at the end of part 3, we'll have an API project that will be secured, and the client application can't send requests unless the client name and the client password are being passed in, and the valid JSON web token has been generated for the client. However, the client is not yet secured, because we don't need to be authenticated in order to access that particular page. So in the last part, we'll enforce the user to be authenticated before accessing that page. The project structure, it's still worth just brushing through this and just so we can have an overview. So we've got the data access that's holding the SQL Server database. We have the API project that exposes the data from the database. We have the server that holds the IdentityServer4 installation. And also we have the client that we'll be creating as part of this tutorial. Okay, again, worth noting, the project URLs and ports. This is not so important now, but it could be along the tutorial. We'll be using the HTTPS URL port throughout this tutorial, so it's just worth timestamping this this slide, or just like screenshotting it so you can have it. Also, you can find the slides in the description. So we've got the 4 entities that we've already discussed: the client app, the API, the database, and the server. The client app is what the user sees. We'll create a new page called coffee shops, say, and then when we get to that page, what it will do at the very first time, it will get the token from the server. As I said, passing in the client name and client password, and if these details are correct, then the server comes back to the client and returns a JWT token. Then this is not done yet. The client takes that JWT token and makes a request to the API, passing in the bearer token along with the request. And then the API validates that token with the server, saying, hey, I've got this token from the client. Is this token valid? And then the server checks that token And then if it's valid, then the API queries the database. The database then passes back the data, returns back the data to the API, and the API returns back the data to the client. So it's this whole process of firstly generating. The client goes to the server and says, hey, can you please give me, generate a token for me? And then here are my details, the client name and the client password. And then the server is like, okay, let me just double check that these are correct for you, returns back the JWT token to the client. And then the client goes to the API and says, hey, can you give me all the coffee shops that you've got in the database? But here is how you know that I'm legitimate. Here's the token that I've just generated with the server. And then the API, okay, sorry, but I don't really trust you. It goes to the server and says, hey server, can you please validate me this token? Because I just received this from the client and I don't really trust it. And then the server validates it again and says, yeah, this is trustworthy, or no, this is not trustworthy, at which point the API just returns 401 forbidden. But then if it's trustworthy, then the API is like, oh, okay, yeah, cheers for that. Goes to the database, queries the data, the database returns back the data, and the API is like, hey client, here is the data for you. And this entire process is what is going on under the hood. If this tutorial has been helpful to you so far, why not hit that like button so that this video can spread to as many wonderful human beings as possible. I would really appreciate it. And yeah, let's proceed with part 3, setting up the Blazor Server project. And this is how the final result is going to look and feel like. As you can see, we are not authenticated. So let's click on the login. This is taking us to the IdentityServer's account/login page with the return URL right here. Let's actually log in with Angela. The password can be found in seed data. Let's log in. So let's go to the coffee shops. First, let's grab a hold of the address to the coffee shops page and let's log out. And then if we paste in and we attempt to navigate back to that page, we got redirected to the login page. And then as soon as we log in, the redirect URI will take us back to the original page that we wanted to access. Okay, so here is the solution as we left it off last time. So we've got 3 projects: the API, the data access, and the server project. If you have not watched the previous video, but if you still want to do this tutorial, then please make sure to check out the part 2. Setting up the identity server, and you'll just be at the same stage as myself, and then create yourself a new branch if you may, which is part 3. So you can feel free to clone the repo and check out part 2. I've got the code down in the description section. Okay, so to add the client project to our solution, right click on the solution and then go to add new project. And then in here, we choose the Blazor Server application. If you can't see it, just make sure to search for it in the templates. Double click, and then let's call it client. And click next. Leave everything unchanged. The authentication type should be set to none. Configure HTTPS should be checked. Enable Docker should be unchecked. Click create. Okay, then in here we'll do a few things. So first, if you double click on the client project, then let's remove the nullable attribute and hit save. Then we'll change the ports that this app is running on by going to under client, properties, expand properties, and double click on launch settings.json, and then under profiles and client, in the application URL property, we need to change this to run on port 5444 and 5001 as specified in the slide at the beginning of this tutorial, and hit save. Then in order for this to run along with the rest of the applications, we need to go to the solution and set startup projects. And in here, we need to start the client project along with the rest of the projects, so the API, the client, and the server. Data access doesn't need to be started, so hit apply and OK. Let's specify the 2 things in the application in app.settings.json. First is the API URL, which just specifies the address of the API, so we can easily get access to it. So that's localhost 5445, and we know that because if we expand the API and go to launch settings.json, we can see that the application URL of the API is specified as being as running on port 5445. And then the second thing is the application URL. And this is what we have just defined in launch settings.json just a few seconds ago, and we'll need this. We'll need a hold of this for a later use. Okay, so let's clean up the client project because when you first create it, it's got a lot of boilerplate components and data and pages. So let's remove the data folder first. Then in program.cs, let's remove the weather service reference. So let's remove weather forecast and remove the using to the client.data. Then inside pages, let's remove the fetch data.razor and the counter.razor as we won't need them anymore. So delete. Also inside the shared project, we go to NavMenu.razor and let's remove those references to the pages, to the components that we've just created. These two ones need to go. And then if we go to pages, right click on it, add, new item. And basically what I'm doing here, you could as well just do a new Razor component, but I have installed an extension called Blazor Components. So to get here, you go to extensions and manage extensions, installed. And basically, if you've got it installed, you can see it here. Otherwise, you can go online and search for Blazor Component and install it. This will allow you to go to a folder, go add, new item, and generate yourself a Blazor component like this. This way, you not only have a front end page, but also you don't get to work with that much C# inside this page. But if you click F7, you actually go in the code behind of this page, so you can just work in here as opposed to just typing your HTML at the top and then having the code section right here and then typing C#. So it's just to separate concerns. It also generates a CSS file for you, which is quite nice, but will work only with these two pages for now. Okay, I just wanted to quickly let you know that I post weekly tutorials on .NET and Blazor, just like this one. So if you're interested, subscribe and join the club. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do here is to add a page directive to expose this particular component at the /coffee shops route. And let's just give this a title of shops. Okay, then in the code behind, we can remove the constructor for now because we don't need it. And let's add a new list. Let's initialize a new list of coffee shops called shops. And this is a list of coffee shop model, which we have created as part of the API project. And this is called coffee shop model. So that's the class name. And then let's inject the HTTP client and the iConfiguration interface. If we press Ctrl dot on the coffee shop model, we are able to add a reference to the API project as well as add the using. So let's do that. And now the squiggly lines will go away. Okay, so in here, we'll override the onInitialized async Blazor lifecycle method. So to do that, we do protected, override, and then this will expose all the methods that we can override, and we need onInitialized async. We need to make this an asynchronous method because we'll have errors otherwise, and remove this. Okay, so first we access the API by just doing http client.getAsync, and we get the API URL, and then we concatenate that with the route of the endpoint. So again, just a refresher, if we go to API controllers and we double click on coffee shop controller, so the name of this controller will be /API/coffee shop. And this is what we've done here. We're accessing the API URL /API/coffee shop. And then once that result has a successful status code, then we define the shops model, which by now it's just an empty a list of coffee shop models. And we define that by doing result.content.read from JSON async, because the data is passed back in as a list of as JSON under the form of a list of coffee shop models. Okay, so if we go back to the coffee shops .razor component, in here what we want to do is essentially loop over the coffee shops that we've got, if we've got any, from the API. So what we're doing is we're creating a new row and we're checking if there are any shops, and then if there are any shops, show something that we'll get to in a second. Otherwise, show a paragraph saying no coffee is available, or it's up to you if you want to put this as data is loading, or check if the request has been finished to say no coffee is available only if there are no coffees and the request is finished. So this is what you do here. So if we've got at least one coffee shop, then we loop through that list of coffee shops by saying for each a shop in the shops list. Then create just a very simple, very basic bootstrap card. And then here inside the body, add the title by doing a shop.name as well as the address. And then inside the footer, just do shop.opening hours. So in order to make this page actually visible, because currently the only way you can access it is by going to the client URL and doing /coffeeshops. However, let's add it to the navigation bar. So if we expand the shared folder inside the client application and then double click on NavMenu, let's actually copy paste one of these blocks so that we can modify it. So say shops. And then right here in the href, we just copy the value from here. So this nav link will redirect to coffee shops, to the coffee shops page, and will be called shops. And also let's change the icon to say OI-map. Before running the application, I've got one more thing that I would like to do. So if we close out of these ones and then we go to the server, expand the server and open up program.cs, then if we scroll down to the bottom, I want us to comment out use authorization and use endpoints because if you try to run this app right now, it will throw an error because we haven't got any default authentication scheme specified inside this class, which we will do as part of this tutorial, but it prevents us from obviously running the application and testing this. So now we can actually start. So please make sure that you go inside the server's program.cs and comment out these lines for now. Okay, so inside the client app, you have already noticed probably the fact that it also opened up the API, so it fired up the API project as well as the server project. So that's okay, that's expected. So let's navigate to the shops page, and it currently says no coffees available. And as soon as it loads, then we can see the coffee shops from our database. Okay, so now that we have seen that we can access the API and all the resources from the database that we basically exposed through the API without any sort of authorization, the API doesn't ask anything, it doesn't accept any tokens and so on. Now we can actually set up authorization inside the API project with IdentityServer4 so that we can protect our API, and then every subsequent HTTP requests that go towards the API will have to be validated, so a token must be passed in. The first thing to do is to install IdentityServer4 Access Token Validation Package. And if you check out the description, you will see that the package that I've listed looks something like this. And you might be familiar with the syntax, but it's still worth noting. It will look something like this: install package, and then the name of the package, and then the version. This is so that it makes it easier for you to just go ahead and run this in package manager console, as opposed to just going to the dependencies, right click, manage NuGet packages, and go to browse and then type this part in. This is the bit that I actually copy and paste right here, but I wanted to make it visible what actual package, to see the icon, to see the description of what I'm actually installing, and to see as well as the version that I'm actually installing, as opposed to just typing this in. So feel free to do exactly this and to copy paste from my description, from the description section. Copy and paste this, it will work just fine. Just make sure that the default project is the project that we are targeting, which in this case is the API. And as a matter of fact, I'm just going to do it with you, and you can see both of these. This is what I'm actually going to install. So if I press enter, it will go ahead and install it for me. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the uninstall button now, and we can see that the installed version is 3.0.1. Which is potentially the latest version available at the time of recording this tutorial. Okay, so now we can go ahead and configure the API project for authorization with IdentityServer4 and Bearer token. And to do that, we open up the API project, we expand it, and then we go down to program.cs. Okay, so in here, right after we do builder.services.add-controllers, we type in builder.services.add-authentication, and then in here we specify the default scheme as being bearer token. So this is what we'll be using across. Next, still in the same block, so in here we do add identity server authentication. and then still bearer. So this will still be a bearer token authentication. And then we specify the options. And then inside here, we do options.authority. And this is the issuing authority, which is the server, which is the project where we have installed IdentityServer on. If we collapse everything and if we go to the server project, expand it and go to properties and open up launch settings.json, you will see here that the issuing the application URL is localhost port 5443, which is exactly what we have specified here. Okay, next we've got options.api name, and this is the name of the API that we have specified in the previous tutorial inside the config.cs. This is the API resource that we have registered, and this actually exists in the database if we did seeding, which we did towards the end of the previous tutorial. So this is the name that we're looking for. If this name doesn't match with what we've got in the database, then the validation will fail and we won't have access to the API resources inside this API. Okay, last but not least, right after we do builder.build, we've got the two bad boys here, app.use authentication and app.use authorization. These are really important so that we can expose authorization throughout our application. So we can go inside our API now, inside our API controller, which is the coffee shop controller. Okay, so now what we can do, we can come in here and say authorize, yeah, and then press control dot to import ASP.NET Core authorization package, run the application again, and let's test this with Postman to see the exact response that we get back from it. If we go in Postman, I've specified already HTTPS localhost port 5445/API/coffeeshop. This is the address to our API resource, and the method should be set to get. And we do nothing else here, and we click send, and as you can see, we've got a 401 unauthorized, and that's because we have specified authorization and we haven't passed in any bearer token, because this is what it expects in order for this to be validated and to give us back the resource. So in this case, all the coffee shops in the database, it requires a bearer token. But you might ask yourself, how do we actually pass in that token? You talk about that token so much that we don't know how to actually pass it in. Well, this is exactly what we're going to do now. So we are going to set up the server application to be able to generate a bearer token and to pass that in with the HTTP request to the API to say, hey, I should be authorized because I've just received a token from the server, and please give me all the coffee shops that you've got available. So it just passes in that token to the API, and then the API's job is basically to validate that token, and then to do its job to return back the coffee shops. Okay, first thing to do here is go inside the client project and go to dependencies, manage NuGet packages, and we want to install the identity model package. And at the time of recording this video, the latest stable version is 6.0.0, so install that. Next, we're going to encapsulate this token generation service inside a folder called services. So right click on the project, add new folder, and call this services. And because we are going to encapsulate the identity server settings inside app.settings.json in just a moment, what we're going to do is create a class, so a model that will store these so we can access them nice and easily from our token service. So right click on the services and let's add a new class called Identity Server Settings. And this will have 4 properties. The first one is the discovery URL, the second one client name, client password, and the use HTTPS, which is just a bool flag. Then let's actually create the token service, but first let's add the interface for it. So click on interface, and this will be called iTokenService. This will only ever have one method, at least for the purposes of this tutorial, called getToken. It will return a token response as a task, and it will take in the scope. So if we press control dot here, we are able to add the using for identity model.client. So now to the actual class implementation, add new class, and then call this obviously token service. And then this will inherit from iToken service, and then control dot to implement the interface. Okay, so we need to add some fields. The first one is the iOptions one of type identity server settings, which is the model that we have just created, and this will store will actually populate this from the controller in a second, and it will store the settings that will specify them in app.settings.json. So that's the first field. Then the second one is the discovery document, which is of type discovery document response. You'll be able to access this by adding the using to the identity model.client. And then the last one is the actual HTTP client class, which we'll use to actually generate the token, to send the request to the identity server to generate the token for us. Right, so press Control dot on the iOptions to add the using for the extensions.options namespace, and then in here we can actually populate and define these values, because currently they are obviously null. So because the identity server settings, we are actually going to inject that. So what I usually do is just I copy this from here, the definition of this field from here, and then I paste it in the constructor, and then in the constructor I do this dot and then identity server settings equals to identity server settings, because this is the actual argument that's been passed in. Following, we just initialize the client by doing HTTP client equals to new HTTP client, and as you can see, the AI has already picked up because I've already done this. And then to actually define the discovery document, we do HTTP client .get discovery document async, which is an extension method provided by identity model. So if we press F12, you'll actually see that this is HTTP client discovery extensions provided by identity model.client. So this is how we're actually able, HTTP client doesn't have this method by default. This is an extension method. And we do this dot identity server settings. So we're passing in the discovery URL taken from the identity server settings. So as you can see, one of the properties is actually discovery URL from the identity server settings. And then we get the result. So again, to get the discovery document, we do HTTP client dot get discovery document async. So we access this method and we pass in the discovery document URL. So where do you want this discovery document taken from? And then we pass that in. So we say here is the discovery URL. And then we grab the result. And obviously, if the discovery document hasn't been found, we want to do something like, if the discovery document is error, then throw a new exception saying unable to get discovery document. So somewhere in this application, this will be picked up and logged, and we'll be able to identify the fact that the discovery document hasn't been able to be accessed. Okay, so then in here we remove that unnecessary throw. Please make sure that you make this method asynchronous so that we can actually use await inside of it. And then we we define the token response as a new local variable. And we define this as HTTP client.request client credentials token async. So that's why we awaited, and that's why we needed the async keyword right here. And then in here, we define a new client credentials token request. So then this is not done yet. And then we open and close curly braces. And inside of here, we define the address as being the discovery document dot token endpoint. We define the client ID as identity server settings dot value dot client name. The client secret as identity server settings.value.client password, and then the scope as the actual scope that we've passed into the get token method. Then again, if the token response is error, then throw an exception. Last but not least, just return the token response back to the caller. Don't worry, I will go over these and they will make more sense after we define the actual identity server settings inside app.settings.json, which is right now. So if we go to the client's app.settings.json, in here, we define a new section called Identity Server Settings. So this should be the exact name of the model that we've just created, which is Identity Server Settings right here. Yeah. We go back in here. So then colon, in here, we add a new property called discovery URL, and you'll notice that the port matches and it's exactly the same one as the server project. So the issuing authority of this URL. And then the client name is M2M client. The client password is client secret, and you can set this to whatever you want. Just make sure that this is actually the one defined inside servers config.cs inside here. And then The use HTTPS obviously needs to be set to true. And then last but not least, the use HTTPS needs to be set to true. So these are the settings. And then inside the token service, if we scroll back down, then we get the token endpoint from the discovery document. Okay, so if we run the application again, and I'll show you the discovery document. If you go to HTTPS localhost port 5443 and /.wellknown /OpenID configuration, you will see that the token endpoint is right here. So this is what we're trying to access from within our token service. This token endpoint from the discovery document that we have defined from the constructor by doing get discovery document async and passing in the discovery URL. And then the client ID is taken from appsettings.json, and that's the client name right here, M2M client. And then the client secret is the client password, and this is the one that we're passing in. So essentially we're saying give me a token, and these are the values. So inside the client application we say give me a token. These are the credentials that you're gonna need, such as the token endpoint, the client name, and the password, and obviously the scope. And then if these are matching on our server, then go ahead and generate me a token so that I can pass back to the API to get the data that I want. I really hope this all makes sense. If not, please feel free to leave this in the comments. I'll try my best to answer everything as fast as possible. Okay, so guess what? We are now ready to actually make use of this newly created token service. So if you expand the client project and then go to packages and open up the coffee shops, I'm just going to pin that up. Then press F7 to go to the code behind. In here, the setup is really easy. So what we do is we inject the token service, and obviously if we press Control dot, we'll be able to add the using for client.services. 2 lines of code inside the onInitialized async right here. First one, the token service to actually get the token, and this is the scope, coffee API.read. Just to pause on that one, we go back to the server, back to the config, and then we scroll down to the API scopes, and we've got defined 2 API scopes, one of which is called coffee API.read, so we're good here. Then the second line is actually doing HTTP client.setBearer token, because this is how we bind the bearer token to the actual request that we're going to execute. So if we press Control dot here, we use identity model because this set bearer token is provided by identity model. So it's an extension method on the HTTP client, on the HTTP client class, and we pass in the access token. So again, just to quickly recap what we've done here, we have injected the token service that we've just created a few minutes ago, and then inside the onInitialized async we get the token from the token service, passing in the scope that we need, and then in here we're setting that bearer token, we're binding that to the request, we're binding that to the header of the request, and then we go ahead and execute the request just as we did before. Okay, so before running this we need to do 2 more things. We need to register the token service inside program.cs. And also, we need to configure the identity server settings, because currently we don't have any way of linking up this particular section to the identity server settings that we have injected inside the token service. So right here. Inside program.cs, right about where it says builder.services.add HTTP client, we do builder.services.configure identity server settings. So this is the type that we want to extract those settings into. And then we take that from builder configuration and get section, and this is exactly the section from appsettings.json from here. These properties will get inserted into this type, so this type will essentially be initialized with those properties. And then before running the application is registering the token service, and if you haven't imported the namespace already, just make sure that you add the using to client.services. One last thing to do here is to do app.use authentication and app.use authorization, so please make sure that you add these 2 ones in. And then one thing that I will do just to illustrate that this actually works is I will comment out the part where it's actually setting the bearer token to the header of this request, and then I'll start the app, because the goal is here to not be able to access those those resources from the API because we haven't passed in a token, and our API actually expects a bearer token from the client. So if we navigate to the shops, to the coffee shops, then we'll hit the breakpoint. And then if we step over this, let's actually test that the get token actually works. So we've got a valid response, and then here is the access token. And the HTTP response is 200. So we know that this actually worked. You should have this exact same type of response, 200, with an access token generated. It won't be, obviously it won't be the same as mine, but you'll have an access token generated. Then if we go ahead and execute this HTTP request, then it will say 401 unauthorized. So that's because we haven't passed in a bearer token. So let's hit continue, and then let's stop the application, uncomment this, and let's do this one more time. Right, so now if we navigate to the coffee shops page, we'll hit the breakpoint once more. We generate the token. We know that this already works. And what we're doing here is we're setting the bearer token to the HTTP request, to the actual header, to one of the headers. So if we hover over HTTP client, then we expand this, and then you'll see that default request headers, and we've got in the authorization property, we've got the scheme set to bearer, and then the parameter, which is our access token, we've got that defined as the parameter of this property. So if we step over this line, then we'll now see the result will be the status code would be okay, 200, and the reason phrase okay. So then hit continue, and we should be able to see now all the coffee shops. So as you can see, now here it is. If you've made it so far, then congratulations, you've made it to part 4, which is actually the last part of this tutorial series, which is to secure the client application with IdentityServer4. So let's get into it. Right, so the first thing that I would like to do, because this is what we'll need now, is going into the server's program.cs, scrolling all the way down to the bottom of the class, and then in here, right after we do add developer sign-in credentials, so about line 41-42, we'll add builder.services.add-controllers with views, and then we'll enable authorization and the block where it says app.useEndpoints, and we define endpoints.mapDefaultControllerRoute. So it's important to do this step because otherwise we won't be able to properly authenticate the client application. Then we have 2 packages to install. We right click on either on the project or on the dependencies, whichever one works for you, and go to manage new CAD packages. And the first one that we want to install is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Authentication OpenIdConnect. So this is the one, version 6.0.1. Then the second one is Microsoft ASP.NET Core Components Authorization. Please check out the description to see both of these and all of these packages listed, so you can just copy and paste them. Worth noting that the second package will enable us to add authentication to our Blazor components, and you'll see why that's important in just a moment, because we'll get to the coffee shops page, but if you're not authenticated, if you're not signed into the application, then you shouldn't be able to access that page. If you expand client, you go to app.settings.json, and inside here, after the identity server settings, let's add a new section called interactive service settings, because we're going to need this to set up OpenIdConnect inside program.cs. That's going to enable OpenIdConnect throughout our client application to be able to properly secure it. And the first property here is the authority URL, and this is the URL of our identity server application. So if we go to server, properties, launch settings.json, you'll notice that the port is 5443. That's exactly the same as in here. So this is the authority, the issuing authority, the project that actually generates the bearer token. Yeah. And then the client ID is interactive. This is one of the clients that we have defined inside the server project. Then we define the client secret as client secret 1. And then the scope is weather API.read. Essentially what we're doing is we're only allowing the client application to only use this particular scope, which essentially just says allowed read requests to come from this API. because it makes sense, because you can link this read to only to get methods, and then write to update or delete methods. So this is what we're going to use as the main scope for this particular example. Then next we go to program.cs. Right about where we register the token service, what we do is we type in builder.services.add.authentication. And this entire block that we're going to type out is setting up OpenIdConnect inside our application. So still inside this function, we define a couple of options. The one is the default scheme, and that's defined as cookie authentication default.authentication scheme. And then the second one is the default challenge scheme, and we define that as OpenIdConnect default.authentication scheme. Next is we do .add cookie, so it's still inside, still within the same block. We do .add cookie, and inside the parentheses for that cookie, we type in cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme. Then in the same block, we do .add OpenIdConnect, and then inside of this function, the first parameter, we type in OpenID defaults.authentication scheme, and then we define again a bunch of options. Again, feel free to clone the repository, check out the specific branch. Right, next what we're doing is we're doing .add cookie. And inside the parentheses, the argument is cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme. Then the last function that we're going to call as part of this block is .add OpenIdConnect. The first part of the first argument is OpenIdConnect defaults.authentication scheme. And then the second part of this function is to define a bunch of options, and these are quite a few options. So the first one is defining the options.signing scheme, and that's defined as cookie authentication defaults.authentication scheme. Then we define the sign out scheme, and again, this is OpenIdConnect defaults.authentication scheme. Then the authority is taken from our app settings.json, from the interactive settings, and we take the authority URL, which is the identity server's address and port. Then we define the client ID as being interactive. Then we define the client secret as the client secret from app settings.json. After that, we define the response type as code. Then we set the save tokens to true. Last but not least, we define the get claims from user info endpoint to true. And now let's import the missing namespaces. Okay, so what we need to do next is add a couple of Razor pages. One is to log the user in, and one is to log the user out of the application. So inside the application, we go to client, expand the client, and then we expand the pages folder. And then in here, we right click, add, and then a new Razor page. And let's begin with the login one. So let's choose a Razor page empty, and then call this login. Let's navigate to the code behind actually, because this is where we're going to do the work. We get rid of the onGet method, and then instead we do a public async task of type iActionResult, so that's the return type, called onGetAsync. And then we define the redirect URI as an argument. So essentially this redirect URI is an address that's supposed to redirect the user after the user has been authenticated. So we're basically checking here if the redirect URI is valid. And if it's not valid, meaning that it's either null or not passed in, or it's just a white space, then we define the redirect URI as the root of our application. So if the user logs in for the first time, they won't have any redirect URL. They just want to log into the application, in which case just redirect them to the root of our application. Then what we're doing is we're checking if the user is authenticated. Then if the user is authenticated already, then go ahead and redirect the user to that specific to that specific address that's been passed in as the redirect URI. And then we return a challenge. And the first part of this challenge is initializing a new authentication properties object. And then in here, we just define the redirect URI property of this object as the redirect URI, be that a proper valid redirect URI or just the root of our application. Last but not least, we define the OpenID default. So we pass that into the challenge object that we're returning. And then we define that as OpenIdConnect defaults.authentication scheme. And let's import the namespaces. And that is it. So again, in short, just to recap really quick, whenever we get to the login page, which is this one, this method will fire up. This method will be called. And it will have a redirect or not, a redirect URI passed in. Be that whether you get to a page, like the coffee shop's page, and you are not authenticated, you are redirected, you will be redirected to a login page, to the login page, and the redirect URI will be set to redirect you to the coffee page whenever you've been signed in. So we're checking if that redirect URI is valid, or if we've got any redirect URI. If not, then redirect the user whenever the user is signed in, redirect them to the root of our application. But then we check if the user is authenticated, then redirect them to whatever they want to be redirected. And then we challenge, we return a challenge with the authentication properties and OpenIdConnect defaults.authentication scheme. And that's it with the login page. And the second one is the sign out page. So in here, pages, so client project, pages, add a new Razor page. And this one will be again a Razor page empty. And this one will be called logout. And again, we'll work only on the code behind. So if you press F7, we'll get sent to the code behind, which is logout.c#html.cs. Okay, let's remove this public void onGet method, and let's inject here a private field called config that's of type iConfiguration. And then let's define that from the constructor. So I type the constructor by doing ctor and then double tap. Okay, really quick, the iConfiguration, we're passing the iConfiguration in the constructor, and then we define the class level config field with the argument that's been passed in. So this is how we inject the iConfiguration in here so that we can have access to appsettings.json. Right, so in here we add our onGetAsync method. So whenever we get to this particular page, then this particular onGetAsync method will fire up. This is an asynchronous method and returns a task of type with a return type of iActionResult. So exactly the same method definition as the one that we've created inside Login Razor page. Okay, so in here, this is really simple. What we're doing is we're returning the signout method. The first part of this method is initializing a new authentication properties object. And then the only property that we're defining here is the redirect URI, and that's taken from the config, so appsettings.json, the application URL. So that's here. So this is where we return the user, which is essentially the address of the client application. So we're just returning them to the root of this application. And this is just another way of returning the user to the root of the application. Then we pass into the signout method a couple of authentication schemes. The first one is the OpenIdConnect defaults.authentication scheme. And the first one is cookie authentication defaults.authentication schemes. Okay, let's import now the namespaces real quick. And this is the last one, and we should be good to go with the logout Razor page now. Another thing that we need to create is a simple Blazor component that all it's going to do is redirect the user to the login page. This is necessary because in the next step, when we're going to modify the router inside App.razor, inside our routing configuration from our client application, we need a way to basically redirect the user to the login page, the Razor page that we've just created. So inside the client application, we expand the shared folder, and we create here, we add a new item, and then here we create a new Blazor component called redirect to login. So this is its only job. Remove everything from the UI side of things, press F7, and let's go in the code behind. In here, to be able to navigate, to redirect the user to the login page, first of all, remove this, and let's inject the navigation manager. Then we access the Blazor lifecycle method called onInitializedAsync by doing protected override. And then onInitializedAsync is right here. So this is a task, and also we need to define this as being an async. And then all we'll be doing here, so remove this and then do navigation.navigate to the login page. This true right here actually notifies the application that the URL has changed, the page has changed. Furthermore, in order to pass in the redirect URI If you remember, we talked about redirect URI inside the login page. So here, this is the original page that the user wanted to access before basically being redirected to the login page because they are not authenticated. So first of all, what we need to do is escape the string first, and then add a question mark to signify the fact that we're going to pass in some query parameters, and then the only query parameter we'll pass in is the redirect URI, and that equals to open and close curly braces, and we do URI dot escape data string, and then we pass in navigation.uri, and then again the navigation is just the navigation manager that we've injected in this class. So now whenever we initialize this component, we're able to navigate if the user is not authorized to access a resource. We navigate to the login page, and also we pass in a redirect URI. Now we're able to use this particular component in App.razor. In here, you'll find a big component that's essentially managing the routing inside our application, and it contains two components, one found and one for not found. First of all, what we need to do is wrap the router inside this cascading authentication state component, and I'm just going to cut this and paste it at the bottom. Yeah. So let me quickly indent this. Okay, inside the found component, we've got the route view. This is supposed to say now authorize route view instead of route view, because we're going to have two more components inside of it. So let's actually expand this component. And then inside of here, we add a new component called not authorized. So this actually triggers whenever the user is not authorized to access a resource, and we redirect them to the login page. So we import this component in, then this component, when this initializes, then it will basically redirect the user to the login page. And this login page we have defined in here. And if we open this up, you will see that this onGetAsync will do exactly what we've configured it to do. Okay, so now that we have authentication installed inside our application, let's actually play around with it. So if you expand the client and the shared folder, let's go in the NavMenu. We shouldn't be able to see this entire menu item navigation link that basically redirects us to the coffee shops page. So in order to actually show this only to logged in users, what we can do is add a component called Authorize view right here, and then wrap this within that component. Then if the user has been authorized, then and only then show them this particular menu item. Like this. So I wrapped this navigation link into two components. One, the authorize view, which essentially says what to see when the user is authorized and what to see when it's not authorized, but we're only using the authorized component right now. And if the user has been authorized, then show them this. However, I would like to add another menu item that's going to be called logout. So at this point, we know that the user has been logged in, but we want to give them the opportunity to also log out, but only see that obviously when they are logged in. So if we add a new button called logout, this should redirect to the logout page, the Razor page that we've actually created, and that's going to onGetAsync. That's going to just sign the user out. And we can set the icon to OI-account-logout. We can actually take this one step further and define the not authorized part of this component, and we can add a nav-link to actually log them in. So if they are not authorized, then give the users the ability to log in. This, the href should point to login, and the icon could be set to login also. Right, so this is how you show or hide parts of a Blazor component depending on the authentication state of the user. If the user is logged in, then they will be able to see the authorized part. However, if they are not logged in, they will be able to see this. And regardless of their state, they will be able to see this. So next, I'll show you how to actually authorize an entire Blazor component. So if we go to the client pages and then we open up our coffee shops. So in here, under the page directive, we have access to another directive. That directive is called attribute, and we can pass in the Authorize attribute to this page. So whenever we get to the coffee shops page, the application actually checks if the user has been authenticated properly, if the user is signed in. If not, they will get redirected to the login page with a redirect URI of /coffeeshops. Did you know authentication also works seamlessly with .NET 6 minimal APIs? Here's a video you should check out if you're interested. Until next time, stay safe.